When the United States government said Russia was going to invade, they were telling the truth. They were telling Russia's about to invade. You saw a lot of people say, bull, no way they're going to invade. This is just another W, and then they did. And this is the topic that I bring everybody into because this is my specialty. This is the issue I care about. I went to LibertyCon to talk about it. I'm a foreign policy guy. It's difficult talking to libertarians about foreign policy because it's usually not their main issue when it gets into like the nitty gritty of policy. Because I usually run into libertarians and the response I'll usually get is, well, it's not our business. Very like kind of like almost like isolationist type of like, you know, we have so many issues at home. There's a lot of issues in the world. Tough shit. Everybody's got problems. It is what it is. It's very sad, but it is what it is, right? So I wanted to ask you quickly, because I am a big supporter of sending weapons to Ukraine. I think we should send financial aid, weapons aid. I think we should be sharing the CIA's intelligence, intelligence network with them. I think we should be helping them when it comes to the exporting of grain. I'm very, very supportive. I went there, obviously. What is your position on that as a libertarian?
Sure. So, well, first of all, don't call me a libertarian.
Okay. What should I call you? What should I call you?
I don't like to be called anything, but for now, for the case of,
I'll call you a cool guy. Can I call you? I'll just call you a cool guy. As a cool guy, right, what's your position?
So yeah, and I want to say this too, because I'm not tuned into like all these things, and I think that's where a lot of this like, well, just let them figure it out comes from, right? Because a lot of people, and that's how they deal with like poverty issues and everything else, like things that they don't know too much about, and it sounds like, oh well, I guess the only solution is to steal from people and give it to them, and so like, you know, welfare or weapons, whatever the case may be, and we're not supposed to do that because we're libertarian. I look at things more practically and say like, okay, look. If you're a witness to a crime, if you're a witness to like some, you know, big guy coming over and beating up some smaller guy, like, don't you have some responsibility to say like, to say like, hey, that's not right. You shouldn't do that. If I'm armed, maybe I can stop it. If there are, you know, a few of us, maybe we can get together and stop it. Like it's a crime that one person is committing and we're witnessing it and saying, hey, like that shouldn't happen. And so the libertarian perspective is to say like, hey, we don't want to intervene in this situation could go two ways. It's one, because that's scary. I don't want to get involved and risk myself, which that's fine. You're not obligated. You have a responsibility. You're able to respond, but you don't have an obligation, right? If you don't do anything, that's not a crime, but you do have a responsibility, and it's the nice thing to do. It's the neighborly thing to do, especially because you might be next. When this guy's done beating up this other guy, you might be next anyways, right? But when it comes to like, you have bigger countries, you have bigger issues. Now you're dealing with something not about, you know, do I have the power to stop this person, even though that's still a question, but who do I trust on my source of information? Because we see a lot of conversations going on. Who's really the bad guy here, right? Is it Ukraine? Like, did they do something to Russia to piss them off? Is Ukraine really like this money laundering operation for the U.S. and that's the whole reason this thing is going on? Is Russia just really bad and they wanted to take over Ukraine? Like, there's all these different narratives coming in, and for people who are all the way over here in the United States, they don't watch a whole lot of news. They're not completely engaged in this conversation. They don't have all those answers. And so, you know, imagine you see two people fighting in a parking lot. One looks bigger than the other. So you walk up and you say, oh, I'm going to shoot the big guy because that's the thing to do. I'm going to save the little guy. And then you find out, no, the little guy was actually, he had a knife and he was trying to rob the big guy. So now you just shot the victim. I think a lot of people are afraid of making that type of decision when there's so much misinformation going around. So, and I can't really speak for anybody else. Like that's definitely something that's on my mind. There's, you know, I see so many things about, you know, wars that the U.S. was involved in that we find out, or at least I found out years afterwards what was really going on and all these other things. Like, it's confusing. So, but let's say we can get past that point and we can say, okay, look, Ukraine is clearly the victim here. They did nothing wrong and they need to defend themselves. Then yeah, absolutely, sending weapons, sending supplies, sending people is the best thing to do, or it's a great thing to do. But the question is should the government be doing it with things that they stole from everybody else? Or should we as a community say, hey, look, no one's going to do anything. We should make it a humanitarian mission and go volunteer and absolutely help them defend. And I know that becomes like a really complicated question for people to answer. Some people are going to be on either side of it. But it's for me, it's the theft issue, because if we justify theft, this is what I see. The government always finds a big tragedy, and it uses that tragedy as an excuse to steal from us. And once we give them the authority to steal from us, it never goes away. And World War II was a perfect example. They started taxing us to pay for World War II. After World War II was over, we were still paying the tax, and that all that money went to nothing but politicians and ongoing perpetual wars that the U.S. was responsible for. And so
when you say the money went to politicians, what do you mean by that?
So you've got politicians who are, I mean, they get ridiculously high salaries themselves. They get bribes from special interests, which is basically money that's relaundered, because the money goes to the government. They redirect it to special interest corporations, and then those corporations bribe the politicians with a portion of it so that they can keep it. That's how all these guys get so rich with the salary that they're on. They give no bid contracts to their friends that run all these big corporations. They invest in all the right stocks, like, oh, well, we know, this war company is going to get a $5 trillion contract next month. Let's buy up all their stock. There's all this kind of stuff going on. And a lot of this comes from the fact that they're stealing from us. So that's not to say that Ukraine doesn't deserve help, but it is to say, okay, but we're playing a prison game here now, right? We're in prison. We're all getting robbed by the biggest guy in the prison, and we're saying, okay, yeah, we'll let him keep robbing us as long as he goes and beats up the other bad guys so that we can feel safe. That's really kind of the game that we're playing now. And what's going to happen when the war is over? Are we going to continue to pay for this, forever? Are they going to find another fight to pick? And also, why is it always that, there's like a million humanitarian issues? And I know you brought this up, and like, it's not fair to say like, well, should we help them because there's other people that need to be helped too? But that is a good question when you have the United States with a military budget that's 3 times bigger than the next biggest military in the world, which is China. 3 times bigger. It's something like $1 trillion a year now.
Yep.
And especially after they ended this war in Afghanistan, they don't have any money to help anybody except for like one specific little thing that they go after. Like, there's all these tragedies around the world, and it's like, no, this one's in our interest for some reason. And like, why is, and like, this isn't a fun question to ask, but it's like, why is the United States so focused on this when there's so many other problems? Is there really something about this? And we know, and like, again, this is all conjecture, because I don't know the details of this. Nobody's probably ever going to know the details of this, but like, there's like this Hunter Biden thing with dealings with Ukraine, and like, all this stuff that we were hearing about, and I don't know how much of it's true. What's that?
Talking about Burisma?
I don't pay yeah, whatever. I don't pay too much attention to like what, but like, there's like a laptop, and there's like some money laundering going on, and he's like out there doing like some, whatever. Like I said, we're hearing about stuff like we weren't hearing about Ukraine 5 years ago. We started hearing about it, kind of just before the election, I think. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, all of a sudden, a couple years later, it's like, oh, now we find ourselves in the middle of a war with, run by a president whose son was like somehow involved in something with that country. And it's like, yeah, I get it. That could just be coincidence, or it could be, it could be a million things. But there's definitely like a lot of questions that are making people raise their eyebrows and say, like, what's really going on here? What's really the truth? So, and it's, mm-hmm. I just want to say this one other thing, because like, yep. I know, like especially like, knowing that you've been there and you've seen this firsthand, and like, I know this, like, some of this might sound insensitive, but I do want to say this, like, ultimately, no matter what is going on, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that there are millions of civilians who are being just, I don't even know the right word to use for it, oppressed, violated, murdered, robbed of their life and their freedom and everything else. Like, I know that that is a fact, and that's no matter when there's a war, that is a fact, and it's usually on both sides too. And most of those people have nothing to do with this, right? It's usually the leaders of countries who want to invade or start conflict with other countries. And they usually send their military, who are just people who signed up for those jobs because, they wanted to protect their country from outside invasion, or they wanted to, they just needed the money and they wanted to get a job to feed their family. Like, most of the people involved, and even most of the people who are shooting, are doing it to save their lives. And that might be true for both sides, because it's like these crazy people at the top who are just like, oh yeah, just start shooting at those people. If they shoot back at you and you die, hey, what's it to me? I'm up here in my palace, and like I'm completely untouchable up here. Like, that's absolutely insane to me. But yeah, so I just want to say that, so you don't think I'm I'm not trying to like minimize like the reality of this situation, but like, it's like, how do we make it stop? Like, how do we make it stop?
So I think there was a lot there, so I don't know really where to start. What was your first point? Because I forgot the first half of what you said. I remember the second half.
I don't know. I've been talking for a while. I would say just start going. I talked about like how much information do we know is true? What can we actually trust?
Okay, got you. Okay, so obviously a lot of people don't know where to get their information when it comes to stuff like this. Most people don't have like reporters on the ground that they could be like, hey, yo, buddy, I heard this thing about Ukraine. Can you tell me about it? And so they have to go trust authority figures, which a lot of times don't have a lot of respect from the American people, either due to the American government either lying to them in the past when it comes to WMDs and stuff like that when it comes to Iraq, or mainstream media not necessarily covering what should be covered and not presenting it in the way it should be presented. That's part of the reason why I went to Ukraine, was because I wanted to give a more gonzo journalist, like on the ground kind of human face to the war. That's why in most of my pieces, like half of the piece is just me talking to locals, while the other half of it's going to be me talking about the war. So I understand that, and I think a lot of that I think it's part of the reason why I think more people should get involved in freelance journalism in countries at war. But the problem with that is that being a freelance journalist is already difficult. Being a freelance journalist in a war zone, when your life is on the line, you don't have the resources of like a giant company like CNN and MSNBC, makes it extremely difficult. It's part of the reason why I believe a lot of people, it's part of the reason why I'm so thankful to all my donors, everybody listening who supports me in that effort. So I understand this desire for information. Now, obviously, this is me talking, and you don't need to take my word for it. But for me, I think this war started hundreds of years ago, when the first Ukrainian independence struggle was suppressed by the Russian Empire, when they banned the Ukrainian language, and like slowly ever since then, it has been the suppression of Ukrainian identity as this idea of like, this is a fake thing, this is like, the Russian identity is the true thing, the Ukrainian identity is this fake offshoot of Russianness. They're basically, it's the same way how you hear sometimes Turkish nationalists talk about Kurdish people, like, these are not Kurds, these are mountain Turks, used to be how the Turkish government talked about the Kurdish population, a denial of their identity. Then in 2014, Yanukovych, who was the pro-Russian leader of Ukraine, pulled out of something called the Association Agreement, which was going to be this deal with the European Union, which allowed for visa-free travel, and it was agreement when it comes to certain like workers' regulations that was very popular, and he promised he was going to sign, but he doesn't, because Putin doesn't want him to sign it. He wants him to sign a separate agreement with Russia. This starts a protest movement called Euromaidan. He responds to this by sending police who tied they took nails and what are they called, like not cogs but screws, and they tied them to flash grenades, and they would throw them into the crowd. So when the flash grenade exploded, the like screws would like tear through their skin and hurt them, and then they outlawed protesting, saying you cannot be in a group of more than 3 people. But all this did was grew the protest movement larger, because all it did was prove to people that, okay, maybe this is a dictatorship, maybe this isn't somebody's for the people. And eventually he fled the country after over 100 people were murdered by the government. And that is when Russia invaded Crimea and annexed it, because they were scared that it was going to go towards the west. They were scared that it was no longer subservient to Russian interests. And that's when they started like funding rebellions in the Donbass. Then eventually In 2022, for what and any number of reasons that you could come up with, Vladimir Putin decides that this is the year where he's going to invade Ukraine. It's kind of hard to know exactly why he made that decision. Definitely since there's no like private record of that meeting of what happened there. But there wasn't like a big moment where Ukraine was like, we're going to join NATO now, or we've officially joined NATO, or we're officially. So that's why it's also confusing where this invasion kind of came from. They said they weren't going to invade. They put troops on the border, did the training operations, and then invaded. And from that point on, the amount of atrocities we've seen in Ukraine have really been astronomical. I've personally documented mass graves. I've personally talked to people who have given me testimony of people being shot for speaking Ukrainian, church choir boys being tortured in basements, trying to get information out of them, just like a treasure trove of atrocities. I almost went to Izium, which actually they uncovered the largest mass grave since the Yugoslav Civil War in Izium, with 447 bodies in one mass grave in a city of like 16,000 people. 16,000 people, 447 people in one mass grave. It was quite atrocious. And so I think a lot of Americans look at this and they very obviously care. They're like, this is something that is atrocious. This is something that's awful. How can we help in some way? And so for me, Americans, I think, want to be involved in the world stage. I don't think Americans by nature are just like isolationists and they want to retract and say, you know what, there's genocides, there's murder, there's conflict, that's just how human beings are, that's how it's going to be forever, that we will not advance towards any forward, this is just how it is. And so I think Americans want to support Ukraine and they want to help Ukraine. And we are in a position that I think is unique in the world to help Ukraine. We are the strongest nation on the planet. We have more weapons, guns, and firepower than God ever could have imagined a nation could acquire. We have the ability to destroy the world 10 times over if we wanted. So that puts us in a unique position to give the rape victim the knife to stab the rapist, as the person is, as Russia throws themselves onto Ukraine. And so I think due to our unique position, Americans were basically offered a question on whether we will intervene or not intervene. And I think most Americans decided that they were comfortable with their taxpayer dollars going towards this, even at the detriment of possibly negative economic outcomes. And I think that even if you disagree with like what taxation is, or you disagree with the social contract, if the majority of Americans believe that this money is going to a good cause, and we know that these weapons are not going to just be given back to the American people in a tax rebate program. It's not like I'm going to walk into the Pentagon and come home with a javelin and a tax refund. These weapons are going to be eventually sent somewhere, or they're going to rot away in a storage house for forever. And so I would much rather they go towards an independence struggle in Ukraine than being used against some random Yemeni village by the Saudis in a bloody, disgusting war. And so I think that in this unique position that we have found ourselves, we have that moral choice. And it seems like most Americans, from all the polling indicated and from our representatives, seem to have made the decision they want us to be involved. And when it comes to the idea of perverse incentives, that the United States might not be in, why are we involved here when we could be involved in, say, Ethiopia, which has a very bloody conflict going on, or I would even say Myanmar, where the people are fighting against a brutal government in the Tatmadaw that overthrew the democratically elected leader Aung San Suu Kyi, which I do think we should be supporting them as well. We have placed sanctions, but we could obviously do more. I do think there are other interests at play. There are strategic interests. But just because somebody has a perverse incentive to support a good cause does not mean we reject their help. If someone came up to me and wanted to sell me an apple because they wanted to make $1, that doesn't mean I look them in the eye and say, I will not accept your apple, or I will not buy your apple because you want profit where I want nourishment of the land. It would be, I think most people would say that would be silly. And so even if there are perverse incentives or other incentives that United States weapons manufacturers or planners could think up for why we should support Ukraine, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. There could be multiple reasons why we support the ending of the drug war. That doesn't mean that you reject support or you stop somebody from supporting the end of the drug war, or you undermine the struggle to end the drug war because the person you're ending it with wants to end it for different reasons. So for me, I think it's a moral question. I think it's up to the American people to decide whether or not they want their taxpayer dollars used in this way, and I feel like they've kind of answered that question pretty soundly.
Sure. And so, I mean, there's a lot of hypotheticals we could ask, like, okay, let's say nobody paid taxes. Would they voluntarily just give this money to the government so that they could give them guns and weapons? And I'm sure some people would say yes, and some people would say no.
That's the other thing. One last thing. As a government, we're in a very specific position, because I've met a lot of Foreign Legionnaires. I mean, I went, so obviously people would go. I met people there in the Foreign Legion, people who have fought and died for this idea of liberal democracy in Ukraine, of them being allowed to choose their own future. But to be quite frank, that's not going to be enough. There has to be, like, the American government, the average person can't just donate intelligence about, like, hey, I was able to hack the mainframe of a Russian intel, they're going to be doing an attack from this direction. This is something that can only be done by an intelligence agency. I don't have a HIMARS that I can just pull out of my backyard and be like, here's this new multiple rocket launcher system that I just had in my backyard. I'm going to send it over to my Ukrainian pals so they could use it. The state is is the only organism, or the only organization that could possibly give this type of help to Ukraine.
Right. Yeah, and look, it's in that position because it's been stealing from people for a long time. And the question is, okay, well, yeah, but that's obviously they're not going to be giving all this money back. So since they have it, should they send it? There's the question of, okay, but if they send it, are they actually going to win? Are they competent? Are they capable? Is this going to turn into something like Afghanistan, where no, they're just going to be fighting it just hard enough to keep it going for the next 10 or 20 years? Because that's another I guess that's another perverse incentive that you could say, where, like, yeah, their goal is not to win, their goal is just to keep things going so they can profit. But regardless, it's like okay, but the question is, there are people on the ground there who are literally suffering because this is going on, and what can we do to help them? So yeah, from a government perspective, the fact that it already exists, sure, it makes sense for them to send the weapons there. But from a perspective of where does this end, and how do we is the government's interest really in peace? What else are they doing that they're not telling us about? Are they willing to talk to Russia and work some deal out, or are they trying to keep this thing going? I mean, look at what's been going on with Israel and Palestine. I think that's kind of the same kind of situation you were talking about, where you have two different cultures and one's trying to erase the other one and say they never existed. We definitely see the same thing. I mean, I hear people saying Palestine never existed. And the U.S. took the side of Israel on that, and I've never been out there, but I have seen some pretty bad footage of stuff that goes on from the Israeli government, where they're literally now encroaching on other land and trying to wipe them out. So and again, that's another war that it's like, okay, who started it? Because nobody can agree on who started that, because it goes back so many centuries. So yeah, it's and the worst part about this is, like, there are innocent people on both sides, and, like, sure, you might be able to look at any conflict and say, like, yeah, but there's more innocent people on this side, and so therefore we should help them. But it's like, okay, at what point do we start talking about how do we de-escalate this so that so that they don't have to protect themselves? Nobody has to go over there to protect them. We don't have to send guns, because the conflict is actually going away. And that's kind of a conversation that nobody's really having. I mean, a lot of it's just like, no, let's send more guns. So, yeah, go ahead.
This war has been going on for 8 years. It's just recently it picked up steam because of this new wave in the invasion. It's now a total war, where before it was kind of more like a partial war in certain regions of the country.
Sure.
Right. And so, but the Ukrainian people have fought this struggle like for hundreds upon hundreds of years. This is not the first Ukrainian army to fight for the idea of independence. And you don't even need to just talk about, like, the UPA, which engaged in some atrocious behavior, but many other, like, Ukrainian freedom fighters who fought for this idea. Voltaire actually wrote about a long time ago about how Ukrainians struggle to be free. They want freedom, but it was denied them. And so for them, this is like a once in a lifetime opportunity for them to attain their freedom. This is the only time in the world most people are even paying attention to Ukraine, where the whole world has kind of stopped and looked over at Ukraine to say what's going on over there, where they're getting sent weapons from the most powerful nation on the planet, they're being sent ammunition from the most powerful nations on the planet, and they're being given the means to defend themselves as Russia is condemned by the United Nations, right? And so for them, and from the Ukrainians that I've talked to, when I talk to them about like, well, how about we end this war now by, you know, negotiating some of the land away, they respond in two ways. First, they say this is the only chance we're ever going to get, you know? There's not like another chance it's going to happen 20 years from now. So if we don't settle this now, the last thing we want is for us to have kind of like a somewhat ceasefire. Then it starts 10 years from now when they're getting less weapons, less support, and there's less attention on Ukraine. And secondly, if they sign away any of their territory, which Russia is demanding for any immediate end for the conflict, and not something that might take more time for the Ukrainians to take more land to achieve, they see it as basically like you're signing your neighbor's death warrant, because the Russians have engaged in execution of protesters, executions of political dissidents, filling up of mass graves, rape of civilians. They've engaged in some pretty atrocious behavior, and a lot of times they've even bragged about it. I've listened to a lot of these phone calls that Russian soldiers make home, and it's so wild to see a man's wife just tell them to use a condom when raping women, so they don't bring back like AIDS and like HIV back to their household, because of the amount of dehumanization that went on. Today I was watching, before you came on stream, Russian state TV, as I often do, because they give a very different message to the international audience that they give to the internal audience. And they called the regime in Kiev a Nazi gay transgender regime. A Nazi gay transgender regime. And this is on the most popular Russian state television show in the country, watched by millions of people. Now, like, inherently you hear that and you immediately that's contradictory. You can't be like gay, Nazi, transgender. Like, the Nazis hated homosexuals. They killed them. Zelensky, like the regime is led by a Jew with the gay transgender. It's ridiculous, but the point of it is to like dehumanize them. The point of it is to like, they are everything that's negative to the Russians. They are gay, they're transgender, they're Nazis. Remember what the Nazis did to us? They're just trying to think of every negative thing to build some false like ideological basis for this war, because it was only supposed to go on for 3 days. And so for Ukrainians, I think they're willing to basically see this war out through the end, because this is like the completion of hundreds of years of independence struggles, and this is like the one good chance that they're gonna get. And so for me, I think we should support them until they win. That's what I think the barrier should be, is when they win. What exactly will victory mean? I don't know that exactly, but I think the most basic of barriers for that should be complete Ukrainian territorial sovereignty, because at least that means the Russians can't kill anybody else. Because the war could stop, that doesn't mean the killing stops, because the state has done a lot of killing without declaring war.
Right, and yeah, I mean that's a lot to unpack, but like I think also, you know, you brought up the question I wanted to ask, which is, what does a victory look like? Because, you know, if it's, you know, look at the size of Russia and Ukraine, and it's like, if they just, you know, they could Ukraine could keep up the fight forever. Like, do they have to wipe out Russia in order to make a win? Because Russia's not, you know, Russia's not going to stop. So I mean, that's a really interesting question. And you know, it's yeah, and I mean, none of this is easy to you know, to answer either. And like, and yeah, and I think, you know, what you say about like the Russian news and what they're, you know, the messages they're giving out. I know a lot of Americans are under the assumption that everything that we hear is equally maybe not equally, but it's misinformation. So they're worried about the same. And so like you see how easily, a government that knowingly controls the government, knowingly controls the media, what kind of message they can put out. In the United States, a lot of people are under the assumption that the media is also controlled by the state, even though it's more, it's not so overt. So people are under that assumption, and that everything that they hear must be false or misleading, even when they tell the truth. And we see this all the time, where when they do finally tell the truth, people refuse to believe that, or they want to just automatically assume the opposite, which is dangerous.
I think that led to a lot of people distrusting. When the United States government said Russia was going to invade, they were telling the truth. They were telling Russia's about to invade. You saw a lot of people say, bullshit, no way they're going to invade. There's just another and then they did. And I think it was a lot of people's kind of just gut reaction was to just reject whatever the government's saying when it comes to foreign policy. And a lot of people, including people that like my colleagues, I would even say, in the streaming world, kind of fell into that hole where they just kind of had that gut reaction of like, whatever America says happening is just not going to happen. And then it did. And then it really shocked a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I don't know. It is, I can't really say what should or shouldn't be done, because, at the end of the day, I don't know how this ends. I don't know what what's the peaceful solution to this, or, what is a win? How do we actually make this stop? I mean, ultimately, that's what I'd like to see. It's like, if everybody surrendered and left their home and left for another country and just let, Russia have the land, it's like, okay, yeah, that might make them stop. That might not make them stop. Maybe they say, oh, well, let's expand even further and take the next country. Who knows? Especially, hey, that was an easy win. Let's continue on. Like, it's really difficult. But I think, like, when you look at the fact that we understand what's criminal, like it's criminal to, take a military and invade another country and that sort of thing. And it's criminal to lie to your people and dehumanize another country, an entire population, and for the purpose that crimes can be committed against them. Like, if we recognize these are all crimes, what's the perfect solution to this? How do we, it's the question of how do we stop crime, big or small, right? Because we can't even stop crime in our own country. We can't even stop crime in our own prisons. It's like, if the United States was a perfect country, why wouldn't we start saying, like, okay, well, everything's perfect here. Canada, Mexico, why don't you join us under because it's just a federal government, right? The United States is just 50 separate sovereign states with a federation between them, right? Of course, it's grown beyond that now, but like, if we had a perfect solution and we had a perfect treaty, then it's like, yeah, that could always be the thing. And then you just have, like, what is it, like the UN, every nation's a member of the UN now, and everyone just gets along just fine. And it's like, no, you're still going to have conflicts, and how do you resolve that? But if you could get the people of other countries to understand, and like, I know this is like, we have this problem where, like, people are worried about, Russian influence on America, right? We don't want the communists influencing us and turning us into a communist state. But if at the same time we could influence people around the world to understand what is criminal and educate them to a degree where they would say, like, hey, recognize this is criminal, we don't want to be a part of this, to the point where the people of Russia could actually look at this and say, like, hey, what our government is doing is criminal. They're lying to us. They're tricking us into a war. They're committing genocide. Then maybe that's actually the solution, where it's not about shooting enough people, right? Because, I mean, think about this too. If Ukraine successfully chases everybody out with guns, you're still going to have people and families in Russia who are like, oh, those damn Ukrainians, they killed my brother who was out there trying to kill them. They're still going to be sad about who they lost from their family, and it's it might take another generation before they say, hey, whatever happened with that thing with Ukraine? They killed our grandparents. We should go back after them.
So I've got a few answers. I think the first thing would be, you asked about, like, Russia's such like a gigantic country. Russia is a big country. But it's lost wars like this before. In fact, it's lost wars like this when the odds were more in its favor. The most obvious example I think people can point into would be like the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I mean, they butchered Afghanistan. There, if you look at a population graph of Afghanistan between the years 1979 to 1989, the years of the invasion, it just goes like, it just dips. For like, they killed like 2 million people, internally displaced millions, and externally displaced millions. And they lost against a bunch of people on horseback with shoulder-mounted RPGs and Stinger missiles, who got shipped these weapons on the back of Chinese donkeys by the United States and China. China was actively involved in funding the Mujahideen as well. Many people don't know that. And they lost. And
they ultimately, like, what's the loss? Like, they decided, hey, this isn't worth it anymore. We're out, right?
They did. And the Soviet Union slowly collapsed afterwards. It was a major contributor to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They went to the brink of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is when the Soviet Union was a lot more powerful than modern day Russia. I mean, it included not only Russia, but it also included Hungary, it included Romania, it included what is modern day Moldova and Transnistria, it included Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, it included Belarus, it included a lot more, Poland, East Germany, which had a very professional military, and included much, much, much more in fighting a much weaker opponent and still lost. And the reason they lost was because it was costing too much and they were bringing too many coffins home. And a lot of Soviet mothers were very angry about that. And so it gets to that second answer. And I think this is like a cold reality. I think to some degree, and I remember hearing this while like reading about the Vietnam War, that there was some like belief amongst the Viet Cong of like, we don't take too many prisoners because if we kill enough, eventually they'll stop coming. And the thing is, they weren't wrong. I mean, you should still take prisoners of war, but they weren't wrong under the idea that eventually the American public were going to turn against the war because it was costing too much, taking too much time, and too many of American soldiers were coming home in coffins. The reason why there wasn't like a massive protest movement against the war in Afghanistan for the last 20 years is because we didn't bring home a lot of coffins from Afghanistan relative to, say, Vietnam or other wars. Right. That's why it felt like the Afghanistan war kind of just like kind of ended out of almost nowhere. And to even like the problem that's crazy about the end of the Afghanistan war is that should be something that Joe Biden should get a lot of credit for, the ending of that war. Like, a lot of presidents said they would do it. He was the only one who did. But all anybody will remember is the disastrous withdrawal and how much of a mess it looked like. Therefore, he's never going to get any credit for that. But relatively, nobody was like protesting against the war that much because we just weren't bringing home many coffins. That isn't the case in Russia. We're talking about casualty numbers that exceed the Soviet war in Afghanistan when they had more people to pull from. We see the hundreds of thousands of people fleeing into Georgia. When I came back to Miami, when I flew into Miami and I was talking to federal officers because they were trying to make sure I wasn't a terrorist because I was coming from a war zone, which of course they were going to do. You want to know what they told me? They said, "Oh, your name is too common, Dylan. We need to talk to you in the other room." The person in front of me's name was John Brown, by the way. But my name was too common. What does that even mean? Too common. But after the conversation, he said, "Oh yeah, I've seen a lot of Russians come through this airport. Russians coming here to sit down, live in Miami, because they don't want to get blown up in Ukraine. And the soldiers are being sent in with worse and worse equipment, being sent in on a bigger and bigger death wish and taking more and more casualties." Russia's a big country, but it's not an invincible country. It's not a country with an endless population. Its population has been going down for years. They can just flat out lose. And I know for a lot of people that's like almost hard to like imagine, but they lost in Afghanistan, we lost in Vietnam, and we lost in Afghanistan. And we're a much more powerful country than modern day Russia is, as you can see from its military performance. We took out Iraq in 28 days. It's been almost 250. And they have an interconnected highway system with Ukraine. We didn't have that with Iraq. We didn't have that at all. It was the occupation of Iraq that was like the massive failure for the American military. They haven't even gotten over stage 1, and that's actually taking over Ukraine. And so that's why I believe that Ukraine can win the war, is I just think they have more of a will to fight, which isn't that crazy. I think as really, if anybody in the world I could speak to about the idea of like fighting and dying and caring above all else for freedom, I feel like talking to somebody who was at LibertyCon. I think you're somebody who's in like an astute position to understand like freedom above all, you know, that idea behind what that many people in Ukraine are fighting for. And so I would say, like, for me and for most Ukrainians that I've talked to, what does freedom look like? There's no Russian soldiers in Ukraine and a sustainable future for Ukraine, as in they know this type of thing won't happen again. And what I'm terrified of, and this really scares me, is that we're going to accept some type of short-term solution, short-term ceasefire that makes this a frozen conflict that'll never go away, just like it was for the last 8 years. And in an attempt to end the conflict as quickly as possible, we accidentally actually extend it by making this a frozen conflict when the Russians are on the back foot and they're scrambling to try to find a way out.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you know, those are all good points. You know, like I said, I'm not an expert on foreign policy.
Oh
so
yeah, I just
learned a lot here.
It's okay. I'm not. This isn't like I'm not like debating you on this. I'm just.
Yeah,
I'm
no,
just
I mean,
here.
yeah, no, it's definitely interesting, and I'm definitely learning a lot. And you make really good points too that are you know, like you know, talking about how you know, Afghanistan and all that. That is all really good points. But yeah, it's you know, I don't know, like I still see like so okay, you talked about with Russia and, you know, losing
one last thing. You went to Mexico to avoid paying taxes to some degree, right?
No.
Or to avoid the authority of the government to some degree.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a lot of people in Russia who would be willing to flee Russia in order to not get blown up in Ukraine, just like Americans fled America because they didn't want to get killed in Vietnam, and we're seeing it.
Right.
Just look up Russia's Georgia, and you can see for fucking like 10 miles, just cars upon cars of Russians getting out of the country. Many of them I've talked to personally, and they've said, "Look, I'm not going to get fucking killed over there. I have no interest in dying in Ukraine. It's not my business. I care about like keeping my job and like feeding my kids. I don't care about shooting some random Ukrainian guy." Sorry, continue. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no. I mean, and it's an interesting point too. But you have like this, you know, why would those people be worried about that at all, right? Because you have, I mean, first of all, like, okay, if their homes were the ones being invaded, right? If Ukraine were invading Russia, would those people be saying like, hey, these are our homes, like, you know, or are they just going to leave? Like, is it that one culture is kind of more stubborn about it than the other, or is it that you know, one is like that's their home turf to worry about? And you know, there might be different. I'm sure there were people in Ukraine who were just like, yeah, I'm not sticking around for this. I'm out of here. And trying to get out. I'm sure there's that too. And you know, just like I'm sure there's people on Russia's side who are like, yeah, war, yeah, let's go for it. I like this. But you know, if the point is that, you know, yeah, a lot of people are fleeing, and so their, you know, their supply of potential soldiers is dwindling. You know, we kind of have to look at like, okay, that's kind of a draft situation, right? And Americans are, I think a lot of them are against a draft in the United States. Of course, we haven't had one in a very long time. So, you know, could they scare us into like saying, oh, a draft's okay? Maybe. But you look at like, you know, what do people have in defense of themselves to say, I don't want to join the draft? In America, probably the people who say we don't want to join the draft, and I'm just gonna, this is just kind of some conjecture here, might be the people who are stockpiling guns on their own and saying, yeah, if the government comes around here and tries to make me join their army, I'm just going to shoot back at them. Whether they will or not is, you know, that's another story. But so they wouldn't have to leave, you know, they wouldn't have to flee to another country to avoid that. And so, you know, there's another question in, so if Russians were educated, maybe educated is not the word, but if Russians became, you know, the type of people who would say, you know, hey, we're going to stockpile our own guns, we're going to reject government authority, and if the government ever comes around to us and tells us we're going to invade another country, we're going to say, no, it's a stupid idea and we're not going to join the military. Would that have the same effect, while at the same time giving people a little bit more freedom from, you know, any other tyranny that you know, that the government might be trying to force down on them in Russia?
So the first question about like if Ukraine invaded Russia, do you think it would be similar? I actually think it would be, because I think there is a massive difference between, hey, I'm defending my village and I'm attacking somebody else's village for some like vague nationalistic reason. Like, I had a lot of like horrific experiences in Ukraine where I met people who had been through massive tragedies, and I remember going through one of my good friends' school when they were a child that had just been blown up. And it's really weird walking with somebody as you're like, oh, that's my old classroom, and it's literally just a bunch of rocks now, you know? It's like just rubble. But that is incomparable if I was to look at my old elementary school and it was just like a husk of a building. Like it was just complete rubble, and the person who blew up was the person like the old woman down the street who gave me cookies every time I came by her house, and like some hot chocolate. If she was like executed with her hands tied behind her back, like that's like unbelievable to me. Like that's like a reality that's hard to comprehend. And so I think that the difference between it happening in your community and somebody else's community is like, for a lot of people, like these issues, like when you talk about like drugs, for example, a lot of people become anti-drug war because they've had that personal experience. My mother was a heroin addict. That's the personal experience that made me learn the drug war isn't the solution to dealing with that issue. It's because of that personal experience. And so I think the same thing would be true if Ukraine was to invade Russia, that personal experience of the bombs that would inevitably have to fall on those villages for any invasion to take place would, I think, kind of like switch gears. It's very easy to like garner up morale to defend your home. It's a lot harder to garner up morale to take somebody else's, you know? Right. I think a lot of people who believe in the private property, I think, will understand, like, this is mine, I worked very hard for it, I want to keep it, you know? I'm a very young guy. I remember growing up with not a lot, and having what I have now, it's like, it's very dear to me, and losing it in some war is very disastrous. So I think it would be different. And I do think it's somewhat cultural, but I think it's like a Slavic thing too. So I think it would be true for both Russians and Ukrainians. The second question was, could you bring that up again? So I got kind of caught up in that.
Oh, if they were able to refuse a draft, whether they were armed or I guess by any other means.
There's so many videos online of like a draft officer saying, hello, sir. And then they're like skedaddle, and they're doing like parkour from building to building to building, dodging this draft officer, doing judo moves that I never seen a grown man do. I'll see a man 300 pounds, you know, fat, like really like a fat guy should not be able to run, turns into Sonic the Hedgehog once he sees the draft officer. As for like Russia is a gigantic country. There's a lot of places to hide, and their logistics right now are pretty dog shit. They're grabbing people who are like 62 years old and giving them a rusty AK-47 from like the year 1950 and telling them to go to Ukraine. There have been videos leaked out of like Russian like conscript officers telling them like, you have to buy your own body armor, you have to buy your own medical equipment, you have to buy all these things, which is already ridiculous. And then they say, sir, you know, there's none in the stores, like everybody's bought it all up because of this call for mobilization. And they'll say, oh, you know, you can use a tampon, it will actually work just like a medical gauze to like suck up all the blood. That's not true. Wow. But that's the type of stuff they're saying. And so for me, it's very hard for me to imagine that if that's how poor Russia's logistics is right now, that they can't even get all these supplies, that it can't be that difficult to go into the middle of Siberia and then just wait it out. I'm going to be honest. Russia is a much bigger country than America. I think there's a lot of places to hide out in the countryside, even if you didn't want to flee out of the country. Russia's actually done this thing where they'll arrest anti-war protesters and then give them a draft notice. And so I think for a lot of people, it's just a lot easier. Just go live with your babushka grandma in Siberia for like a year until this war's over, instead of getting killed in Ukraine. But when it comes to the idea of them having like guns and stuff and defending from the government, it's hard for me to imagine the Russian government would want to either engage in these shootouts because this mobilization's already going really poorly. But I've also seen them, like, if you think Waco is bad, like, Russia will engage in Waco in an instant if given the opportunity. There was actually an example of where like some terrorists like took over like a school with like children and like started demanding like independence of some regions and stuff, and the Russian government was just like, okay, blow up the school. They're like, what? No, blow it up. And they just started firing like tank shells into the school. So so on one hand, I'm thinking like the logistics are already so bad that maybe the Russian government would just say, fuck it, I guess we're not going to take this guy as a gun. We don't want to deal with it. But on the other hand, the Russian government has historically shown that it is very, very, very willing to not care about casualties when it comes to like forcing people to do things. But if it's one guy, I doubt they're going to go on this giant goose chase. So I think
right, because they're already trying to get everything over to Ukraine to win that, right? They're not going to go blow up a bunch of buildings. But yeah, I mean, but it's, you know, it's always a risk, and then there's always the risk they're going to, you know, okay, yeah, we'll make an example out of this guy just to scare everybody else. But I did see one video where there was, I think it was some guy shot a recruiter.
Yep, Zihan, yeah, Patriot Zihan, we like him at this channel.
Yeah, that was Russia, right? That was
so
his friend had just died.
His friend, who didn't want to go to war, had been sent to war, and he was getting recruited, and he was very angry about it, and so he went and said, "Sure, I want to sign up," and then he took out a gun and just shot the dude in the head or in the chest. There's a lot more instances of like direct action of people like targeting recruitment centers and burning it down. After mobilization was done, there was, I think, like a 200% increase in vandalisms targeting like these types of centers. There was already like people like throwing Molotovs at these places, but it really went up afterwards. It's not like full-scale rebellion. I don't want to like overplay it, but we're seeing more and more instances of this, especially in Belarus. Belarusians are not having soldiers fighting this war yet, but they're very scared that they'll be forced to, and Belarusians are more anti-war than the majority of Russians are.
Yeah. Well, do you know what happened to the guy that shot the recruiter?
Oh, I have no clue, and I doubt we'll never know, but there's no way that dude's going to see the outside of a prison cell anytime soon. If the dude's even still alive, I have no clue.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. It's definitely it's crazy out there. I do need to run, but
no worries, man. This was a really good talk.
Absolutely. I'm glad we like I said, like, you know, I did learn a lot from this, and it's definitely giving me some different perspective on that. But yeah, that was a great talk.
You said you had a few more minutes. Is there anything else you wanted to ask me before we wrapped up?
Man, I don't know. I've already gotten so much from you that like I know I'm going to be thinking about for days. Yeah, well, yeah. Let me ask you this: what was kind of the deciding moment when you decided to go out there? What made you want to do that?
So I was covering the war from my apartment, and I had made an astronomically large amount of money covering the war. I made like $10,000 in a very short period of time, which for me, that's like a lot of money. Definitely as somebody who's like, you know, I'm like 21, right? So that's like a lot of money for somebody my age. And I felt really weird about it because like everybody was covering the war, like every commentator was giving their hot takes, and like just watching. Like I remember there was a period on Twitch especially where every single streamer was just like sitting there watching the Kiev camera live stream, just this random camera set somewhere in Kiev, just watching it, just waiting for something to happen, just waiting for either Russian soldiers to roll into the city, somebody to die, blow up, and it felt really weird. It felt really weird to be like, hey guys, thank you for the $5 donation. Man, that guy's burning alive. That really sucks. Anyway, thank you for the $20. And it felt very kind of like, it felt artificial. It didn't feel like I was contributing enough for the amount I was actually making. And so I felt like, what can I do with this money? I was like, well, one thing I could do is take this money and reinvest it into my coverage to improve it, to make it so I feel like I earned it. Right? I ended up spending a lot more money going to Ukraine than I ever made off of it. But I think it was worth it also, because I do think that the fight in Ukraine is the front line for the struggle for democracy. Because it's very clearly like a Russian government unhappy with the democratically elected government that replaced the government that was trying to outlaw protesting and brutalize protesters. And they're not happy with it because it doesn't serve their interests. And so they're invading. And so the Ukrainians are unhappy because they've fought hundreds upon hundreds of years for their identity. And you can hear Putin in his speeches, like, deny their identity. And I think it's like a very clear, like, moral struggle. And for me, even if I was to go to Ukraine and like get hurt, killed or something like that, from my upbringing, right, I think I'm happy with myself for not being like hooked on heroin and like dope and shit, considering where I came from. And if I was to like get hurt or like die in Ukraine, it would be for something a lot more worthwhile than what a lot of people my age are like dying for in like drunk driving accidents or like overdosing. And so for me, I think it's a righteous struggle to be involved in. And I feel like a lot of the people going to Ukraine, just like a lot of the people who went to northeastern Syria to fight against ISIS, this is like the modern kind of like Spanish. I don't want to say Spanish Civil War because it's not a civil war, but this is like, this is really important to me on a personal. I would say this war really is like, this is my life now. Like everything around my life is centered around this war and covering it and talking about it. And also like having an impact was really good for me. Being able to like see like the body armor that I helped like bring out, like being used by aid workers to deliver aid to the front line, and like somebody put my logo on like an ATV being used by forces around Kharkiv, and that was pretty fucking cool.
Nice.
And like, so I just want to contribute as much as I can, and I always am constantly worried that I'm not doing enough, to help, and I just hope I'm doing enough.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I mean, like, I totally support that. You know, you kind of, I mean, you know, risking your own safety to help other people. And I think that's, you know, that's something. It's, you know, everyone's going to pick a different fight, but to say that we should all do something like that when there are so many people who are just afraid to, like, you know, like, even if it's just, you know, someone's getting in a fight and they want to take out their phone and film it instead of helping somebody. Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's a great example for what we should do as humans. Because, like, yeah, I mean, like I said, you can be perfectly safe and live a sheltered life inside of, you know, a brick cell or something, but it's like that's not a great life. And
you can't you cannot live your life to its fullest without putting it in jeopardy on at least a few occasions.
Exactly. So yeah, absolutely. That's pretty awesome, man.
Thanks, man. And thank you so much for coming on. You are extremely pleasant in person. You're also very pleasant online, which I'm happy that's the case, because some people change when you interview them on the internet. Well, now that you have a screen between them, now here comes the
now we can fight.
Now we can fight. Now we can fight to the death. Maybe next time. But I really appreciate you coming on. You were very lovely. Do you want to shout anything out before we end the call?
Yeah, let me. I've got a wine company that I started called The Blood of Tyrants. Which that feels really dark now after we're talking about Ukraine, but
that's fine. Hey, yeah, we bathe in the blood of tyrants over here, right? Quite literally, man. Quite literally.
Yeah. So blood of tyrants.wine, you can go pick that up, and you can use the code no taxes and get a little discount there. And that's
I saw you at the after party, by the way. We saw him at the after party with this bottle that said Blood of Tyrants on it, just pouring it into random people's cups. He's like, "Who are you? I don't know. Here's some wine. Here's some wine. This is my wine." It was fantastic. He's a real party animal.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I just want to say this too, like, not really shout out, but I do like to tell people that real freedom, that comes from inside of you. You can't expect, no one's going to give it to you. No government's going to give it to you. Your friends aren't going to give it to you. You have to believe that you are free, and you have to live your life as if you believe it. That's the only way you're going to be free. Nobody's going to give it to you, and you really have to fight for that. So I know that's what you're doing. But I think everybody should be encouraged to do that. We need to learn to think freely, question everything, and, you know, if somebody tells us what we have to do, ask why. Learn to be free, and that's how life's just going to get better for all of us once we all figure that out.
Absolutely. One last question I needed to ask you: what do you think about sovereign citizens?
Oh man, so okay, I'll try to make this really short. I learned about them when I first, like, I was always fighting traffic tickets since I learned how to drive. But I learned about them somewhere along the lines, and I was like, hey, this is really great, but it sounds like total BS. I found out a lot of it was true, but at the same time, they mix in so much BS that it's like I tell people just stay away from it. There is some true stuff to it, and sometimes when I talk about the true stuff, people are like, oh, is that sovereign citizen stuff? And I'm like, no, it's not, because that's this with like a ton of extra BS on it. So yeah, it's
Do you support the living man? Are you familiar with the living man?
no.
Okay, I need to have you back on the show, and we're gonna do a live reaction to this, to my favorite sovereign citizen, because I feel like you're gonna give me a pass by you being there, because you're, to my audience, you're sovereign citizen enough that I can watch you and let all my biases fall around, and it's no longer too mean against him. Okay, so next time I have you on the show, we're gonna have to watch together.
If anything, I might point out some of the BS that he's saying if I can recognize it. Like sometimes it's just like I don't know, I'd have to look that one up, but like some of it I know, and it's like, yeah, that's total BS.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You have a good one. Stay feisty, and if the IRS comes a knocking, man, okay, you gotta dodge and weave. You need to act like a Russian is about to be mobilized. Run away. Run away.
I gotta
okay?
go find that video now.
Awesome. You have a good one, okay?
Awesome. All right, have a good night.
Bye-bye. That was a lovely conversation. I'm very happy with that conversation. I am legitimately happy with that conversation.